A very good day, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank RIHN for organizing this extremely important event. In 2018, I had published a science fiction novel called The Butterfly Effect about an illegally released genetically modified rice affecting the health of millions in the backdrop of climate disasters. Perhaps the bad karma of taking my readers on an albeit entertaining trip through dystopia that hung heavy on my shoulders was somewhat cleansed thanks to the opportunity provided later by RIHN and World Weaver Press to work on an anthology of solar punk stories from Asia Pacific themed multi-species cities. Today I will try to explore other stories and other cultures that challenge the dominance of the modes of production, distribution and consumption of food. So I am going to do it in 3 or 4 sections. First, I will touch a bit upon Tolstoy's famous story, How Much Land Does a Man Need? Then I will move on to advantages, needs, uses, and impacts of eco-fiction or climate fiction, which are closely allied to food stories. Then I'll try to storify 1 or 2 examples, real-life examples of alternative food cultures, and then finally close with a few tips about story writing. How Much Land Does a Man Need is Lev Tolstoy's well-known story about a greedy peasant who is offered as much land as he can circle in a day by the nomadic Bashkirs. With mounting greed, he goes on farther and farther for a little more, but fails to make it to the starting point before sundown, falling dead right at the finishing line. This is a classic fable of greed, punishment, and in case of people and the planet, unsustainable living. The creamy white and aromatic Radha Tilak rice is said to be a favorite of Radha, the divine consort of Hindu deity Krishna. It is also a folk variety which has survived the assault of high-yielding seeds. Such simple produce-related stories easily resonate with many consumers, helping them make a choice. There is the well-known anecdote of the conference found in Storytelling for Sustainability in Higher Education, where years later people remembered stories about the subject they had told each other while not clearly remembering people's names or affiliations. Clearly, the appeal, emotional connect, and recall value of stories can be hardly overemphasized. Stories simplify the message, besides acting as glue between practitioners, activists, storytellers, consumers, and producers. Stories help imagine possible futures and make scenarios and pathways meaningful to planners, among others. The gap between reader, listener, and actor can be bridged by a story. Also, stories can be vehicles to communicate sustainability goals, production and consumption flows, and change in attitudes and behaviors at individual and societal levels. Nick Admussen, in his 6 proposals for the reform of literature in the age of climate change, have called for stories that do away with progress-based narratives, retire the portrait of the single soul, and to stop yelling over biomes. He also asks us to choose systems over objects, and his proposals stress on practical ethics against personal ambition of the storyteller writer, while also emphasizing on the urgency of the poor to speak for herself and not through us. Most of these are also relevant for stories envisioning futures. Two studies led by Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, and these studies were conducted on climate fiction readers, found that younger, more liberal and more climate concerned people, among which are many millennials, read more of these stories. This study also noted dramatic emotional responses and that these stories help readers imagine potential futures. Also, progressives as against conservatives were found more likely to be nudged by climate fiction from their cautious to concerned position or from concern to alarm vis-a-vis climate change. They also uncovered the importance of repeated readings without which effects of these stories wash away, and the focus of the story world on particular problems, say drought versus flooding, was found to color the beliefs of the readers of climate change fiction. Another story that connects us with the ingredient and can help conservation efforts. These are my rice selfies of a variety called kalo bhat or black rice from Bengal, and on the top left is a traditional sweet rice pudding called paesh I made with it. This folk rice variety is sourced from a conservation-linked business called Amar Khamar. It is said Chinese noblemen grew this rice for themselves and common people were not allowed to use it, so the name forbidden rice. So now we present glimpses of and experiments with alternatives before moving on to storyfying one of these. Edible Archives is a sustainable food restaurant in Goa run by Onumitra Ghosh Tostidar and Shalini Krishan. I was aware about the initiative from friends and media reports and interviewed them to dig out their story. More about them soon. Next comes Debal Dev's work with conservation of folk varieties of rice through farms and organizations like Boshuda and Brihi. He has made useful interventions in conserving more than 1,000 landraces with specialized nutritional, climate tolerance and other profiles. Another area of alternative food cultures and informal practices which could lend to inspiring stories is in scarcity-driven practices that were sometimes mainstreamed. For example, diets consisting of kochu shak taro, muri, puffed rice, googly snails were not invented during the Bengal famine of 1943 but linked to it also rationing, and the famine made roti, which is a wheat flatbread, popular in Bengal. Previously it was only rice. Again, the use of flower petals, vegetable skin cooking are also famine-era practices that have been sustained. For these, see Aditi Sen's Bengal Famine and Thakuma's Kitchen in Mint and Sharanya Dipak's A Forgotten Holocaust in Atlas Obscura. During the COVID lockdown, Onumitra of Edible Archives, and I'm sure many others, discovered that sweet potato leaves as well as spinach, stems and roots, which were easily available, can provide essential nutrition to their teams and neighbors. Let us now look at the nuts and bolts of a simple story. The story has a plot which is basically the dynamics of goals, motivations, obstacles, and resolution. Also, a story has characters and settings. Here is one way of introducing a character. The stranger came in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. So you introduce a character like this. This is Invisible Man. Similarly, we can begin with the stranger appeared in the flooded village of Sundarbans in a leaking boat a few weeks after Cyclone Aila's death dance. The signs of devastation were all around. He had a weather-bitten face, a slow, purposeful gait, and fiery eyes that gleamed with otherworldly light in the lightning flashes of another approaching storm. He listened carefully to their stories. People washed away, the broken embankment, and about the storm surge which had sent salty water deep into their croplands. What will they survive on? For the fields which fed them were as good as dead, the soil poisoned by the curse of the salt. Now that the obstacle or the story conflict has been introduced, the story conflict is the curse of the salt. We can take our plot to tell the story of Lal Getu, Nona Bokra, Tal Mugur, all salinity-tolerant folk varieties of rice brought to the village by the stranger scientist and conservator Debal Dev, a real person, of course, which helped the villagers claw back towards food security in the face of the cyclone and climate disaster. So let us now try and tell a story similar to the one we experimented with just now. A story using some of the inputs gathered from Onumitra of Edible Archives restaurant using the elements and methods mentioned before. These are various varieties of rice, as you can see. Who is and are the main characters here? Onumitra the chef, Shalini who takes care of the farm, a Thai chef, who is kind of a secret guardian. Similarly, the scientist is our main character in the previous story. Let's focus on Chef Anumitra and see how she carries the plot. For our purpose, to understand a character better, we can use character bios. We ask, is she fun, affable, serious, academic, hardworking, energetic, romantic, team worker, nasty? What kind of work does she do? What is her family background? These are all questions we ask about a character. We can have a character outline in this case, like friendly, warm-hearted bibliophile and a PhD in cognitive linguistics who always wanted to be a chef. Her Bengali upbringing introduced her to a vast repertoire of cooking ingredients. This is Anumitra's real-life story. So a tip in fashioning characters is to know your audience and use familiar, identifiable characters for better connect whenever possible. Which brings us to setting. Where and when do your characters live? Where does she become who she is? Where does Anumitra live and work? What's special about this or these places? What are the problems peculiar to this setting? We can begin with the setting of her studies when PhD Blues drove her to try and get work at Tamura-san's Japanese restaurant in Delhi, which is where she says she learned a lot. From there, she moves on to opening takeaways and eateries like Bento Bong and the Big Bong and working with celebrity chef Ritu Dalmia at Diva, all part of a growing awareness about local sourcing. But always try to tell a story close to a major turning point. Here it happens in Anumitra's case. She was working in a Thai restaurant. And that is where you can begin your story. What's special about this Thai restaurant? Is it pretty, windy? Describe that place a bit. It might be that this place has a problem of its own that drives the plot forward. But in our case, in Anumitra's case, it was a question asked by the Thai chef at the restaurant. One day he brings 3 green coconuts for her to taste and asks her to tell him which one came from near the sea, which from near the river, and which from near a lake. This question triggered many ideas that were floating about in her mind for years. Questions of food and where it comes from, food miles, conservation of seeds, and so on. This, coupled with her background, will finally drive her towards sustainable food and the stories surrounding food. But this is revealed later. For now, let us look at goals. Related to motivation and closely connected with your character are the goals. Motivation sets you off on the journey, the goals at the end of the journey. Sometimes broader goals are in the background of what we do, but they always fuel our story. In Anumitra's case, the immediate goals would be reducing waste, reducing emissions, local sourcing, conservation, green consumption, and the broader goals, sustainability, SDGs, and so on. So a tip here is write down your core message and create your story around that, or begin with engaging story starters. Which takes us to obstacles. All these pictures are from edible archives in these slides. The goals and motivations lead her to participate in a major exhibition and finally set up edible archives with Shalini, but obstacles are on the way. The story is still not over. Without obstacles, crisis, conflict, problems, there is no story. In her journey of locally sourcing ingredients and serving sustainable meals that come with a story, she faces obstacles like disbelief among customers, who say the stories of folk varieties of rice are untrue. She notices restaurants marketing imported salmon dishes in the midst of COVID lockdowns. The pervasiveness of the high consumption culture and low awareness about alternatives leads to disillusionment. She also notices customers asking for sushi, but she is not prepared to use a Californian rice variety that is used for sushi in her country. So, obstacles. What is the road to resolution? Finally, the plots of our stories are resolved when we achieve our immediate or long-term goals. Anumitra, through her allied farmers groups, discovers a rice variety from northeastern India, Nagaland, whose starchiness, texture, and other features closely resemble rice used for sushi. She rustles up a pumpkin-based sushi with the sticky rice, which is an immediate hit, saving many food miles. Visitors love to hear her stories about these dishes, the local ingredients used. They visit the farm, get to know how they compost all their waste, while she plans new ways and means to make sustainable food fashionable, interesting, and part of mainstream culture. Many of our own projects are still on the road to resolution. The goals are still to be achieved. Describe the conflicts, the journey. How far have we come? Then we have the 7 basic plots. Also, we have we have the 7 basic plots. It has been argued that all plots can be boiled down to these 7 basic storylines or more elaborately into 36 dramatic situations. But all said and done, in our stories we will need characters, settings, conflicts, motivations, goals, and resolutions, which may have been reached or not. While basic plots can be innovatively used to tell stories of better food futures, there are other typologies of plots borrowed from Cli-Fi which can be helpful in approaching stories of sustainable food futures. Thus, the sphere imaginary of Gregor Anderson's typology. Many solar punk narratives, mitigative versus adaptive scenarios described by Jeffrey Barber, tech-heavy versus cooperation-heavy plots, among others, can be employed to write engaging food stories. Then again, I have tried to do a typology of near future food stories here. Next slide. Stories and narratives like video games, YouTube, etc., of positive sustainable food scenarios can also be categorized as those hinging on producer actors like Edible Archives, Kira Karai, Amar Khamar, etc., consumer actors like famine, COVID-related innovations, influencer actors, a positive spin on mukbang videos of online eating to promote sustainable food maybe, Debol Dev's work, Kent, a Naga person's food blogs, video blogs, or some of these which blurred these lines. So there are various other ways, and this is another way that I've tried to categorize food stories, stories about sustainable food, and ways these stories can be told. Producer and ingredient related stories, example for varieties of rice, can influence the wavering consumer who is otherwise easily swayed by aspirational buying and marketing, like that Radha Tilak variety story I told you about, the Radha Tilak. Finally, some tools for storytelling which are commonly taught in writing classes but could be of help for us too, like POV, point of view. Will you tell your story in the first person or the third, where you, the storyteller, is like an omniscient narrator? First person stories can often easily engage the audience. Also, good stories are told by describing, which is called showing, important incidents through scenes instead of bland narration or telling. Finally, among various ways that a story can end, the crystal ball ending might be well suited for some of the stories we as activists are going to tell, where we take a leap into the future to see how things stand 10, 20, or 30 years from now. Remember Hunchback of Notre Dame, that scene, that last scene. So whatever be our capacities, let us imagine and work for a sustainable food future. Thank you.